Hello, YouTube. This is Hinsug. My real name is Aaron Kamenson, and I have an ultra experimental one for you today. I want to give you like this big picture illustration of the inevitability of schizotypal, also pronounced schizotypal, and schizoid adaptations to the way the world is, and just to kind of wind it together with things like ADHD and depression and some people's conceptualization of their own introversion and autism. So first I want to talk about how there's a schizophrenia-spectrum. There's people who are completely disabled by it. You know, they can barely take care of themselves. They won't get out of bed. They have a hard time even telling what's real. They're afraid of everything. They're like ultra paranoid to the point where they're delusional about everything. And it's not adaptive. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there is an adaptive version of schizophrenia that I think is related to everything everybody thinks about with things like autism and depression and just adapting to the world and having a different point of view. Because like a lot of people, and in my channel there's this sort of introvert, like thoughtful introverted sort of person that knows there's something different about them and can't decide how much of it's good, how much of it's bad, if they're broken or not. And there's something so, even if they're expressive and articulate, it's like there's something about their introversion where they know that they've kind of left the building in terms of the dominant cultural narrative in the world. And to kind of get into this, I want to start with thinking about the way our attentions and focus works. Sometimes you're completely tuned in to what's going on without you, around you, and what's being said. Sometimes you can't possibly pay attention or focus on anything. And in the case of depression, can't even focus on things you know you do care about. And so to start, think about ADHD. So kind of the main symptom of it is your attention can't be controlled and you're having a hard time focusing. And a lot of people with ADHD are also impulsive and have a kind of jump between jobs and their attention flits around wildly. I want to argue that is kind of the first step towards a person's mind just kind of leaving the building. Because I don't think it's a coincidence at all that people with ADHD are said to be much more likely to develop, dramatically more likely to develop schizophrenia. And also, it's not at all a coincidence that people with depression have issues focusing. And it just so happens that autism and schizophrenia both have instances of disorganized thoughts and even psychosis. Autism, one of the symptoms sometimes is actually psychosis. And I want to link all these things together. You know, so it's like the world and people functioning in it. It's all about everybody's telling themselves a story. And it's a story everybody hops in to kind of organize themselves into functioning in this world. And this main story isn't meeting everybody's needs. Maybe a lot of us have an additional narrative. So there's two narratives. There's this dominant cultural one, and then there's this alternative narrative that maybe we're telling ourselves, and maybe the goal is to squeeze them together and twist them together as often as we can. Maybe, you know, just whatever we can to unite them so that we're on board and we feel like we're together with this thing. But a lot of us don't. A lot of us jump out, and whether it's like some version of introversion or some version of autism or some adaptive version of schizophrenia, it all seems to come back to this sort of additional way to function and detach from the world. So let's talk about a character for a second. Maybe we'll just call the character Hinsug, and maybe some elements of Hinsug are fictional and some aren't. And maybe he's kind of multiple characters in a way, but Hinsug, he doesn't feel particularly attached to anything. He doesn't. The way the world is just seems like it's tormenting a little bit, and that the world just feels sort of animal, and people are rushing after things for reasons that he hasn't felt quite invested in, and he just does what's easy and tries to find his own solace and peace and respite in his own personal mental narrative. He's functions in the world, but he's basically left the building. The world says you should do this and this and invest yourself in this, and Hinsug's just work in retail now. He feels weird, identifies with personality types that are introverted and intuitive, because it's like this thinking seems to be on a different wavelength, right? His narrative is different than the cultural narrative around him, and he found really open-minded friends, some of which are neurotypical, maybe with a hint of depression, some of which are healthy and adaptive, one friend that's schizoid and one friend that's also schizotypal. And they kind of work together with each other's quirkiness, open up and share thoughts, and they're open-minded enough that the quirkiness is exciting and fun. But in their lives, they are just sort of functioning. Hinsug has extreme social anxiety because he feels different and doesn't know really what's going on in the social world, and it's not clear if that means he's autistic or not. People generally seem to like him, but he kind of feels himself as sort of a polarizing figure in the world, and he's just working retail and feeling pain all the time because he's in this wild kind of animal world filled with anxiety, and he wants in every way to remove himself from it, to get a solitary job so that he can spend more time in his internal world and less time in this world where he's just sort of doing what he can to meet practical needs so he can escape back into his mind. Hinsug is definitely schizotypal. And here I want to inject an idea I got from a lecture I'll post a link to by a wonderful professor by the name of Dr. Sapolsky, who talks about schizotypalism, and he paints this picture of a schizotypal person, wanting to work 8 hours in a pitch black room running the projector of a theater or running a lighthouse. This really solitary jobs. He can live in his mind, and can be in that dark, alienated, beautiful world running a projector. And it's like Hinsug has one foot in reality and one foot out, and it's kind of combined them in a way that feels good and feels safe. And Hinsug's weird, and his perspective is different enough. Hinsug, interestingly enough, spent his whole life wanting to be a priest. He kind of let himself believe that he was kind of a spiritual being, because it seems like, as people are, even when they're part of the cultural narrative, there's something animal about them, something not worth trusting and worth detaching from. But he loved the idea of being a priest and showing people this world where you can transcend your kind of earthly mortal coil, people's basic animal nature, like saying, let's step out of that and transcend it and see something more. And that was this beautiful idealism that he thought. And that core of idealism became his whole identity. And he decided he's a personality type that's an idealist, the INFP, introverted, intuitive. So it's like big picture thoughts on a different wavelength than other people. And that's such a beautiful identity for him that frees his mind to say that I'm different and I know I'm different. And as he grew into his self, eventually his different nature kind of caught up with him, and the schizotypal detachment sort of catches up with him, and he needs to make peace with why he feels different, and make peace with his decision to adapt to the world by essentially leaving it, but also functioning in it, because schizotypal isn't the unadaptive part of schizophrenia where they can't function in the world. It is functioning. It is even, Dr. Sapolsky even argues it's genetically selected for. And in fact, the origin of things like religion, injecting that sort of abstract, idealistic nature into the world and producing this thing that strikes people with awe and does get them to step back and look at things differently. Like, as though there's something about those perspectives, even whether or not it's something that's like hallucination. People think schizophrenia, they think delusions and hallucinations. Well, what if you just take these aberrant thoughts and sensation of seeing a different wavelength and kind of combining them into something that's exciting, different, and wanting to produce these stories that make people feel a certain way, to maybe even change the cultural narrative, because there is a cultural narrative and there's always things about it that are changing people's perceptions that they become dogmatically attached to, right? There's a lot of ideas that people end up swearing themselves to. And if you can just hack into that and adjust it a little bit. Well, the other thing about this character that makes this character inevitable is something called anomie. There's something about the world that starts almost like a cultural disintegration where people are becoming less rooted. And some of the elements of rootedness are really bad, right? And, somebody who's schizotypal can stand back from that. But there's some parts of the world that are orderly and good, that kind of keep us in flow. But anomie is this element of sort of cultural disintegration. And I want to argue it's kind of related to the division of work. When people have needs and we want to set up a world where people can work towards getting those needs met. But the way the culture is, and having a hierarchy with some at the top, some in the middle, some at the bottom, there's supposed to be this system that people can be a part of where they're making progress. And there's a lot of people that they give up on that system. And there's some parts of the world, he worked retail, right? There's some part of that world you're trapped in it. It's like you got a mortgage to pay, making investments in things that should kind of get you out of that space. They don't feel worth a risk, so they're just trapped in this situation where they're working hard and they don't build enough status to maybe say get the mate they want, to provide for the mate they want, or or to feel a sense of autonomy and independence, and like they're a full person. Instead, they have this role in society that's they just become complacent in and fall into, and they're stuck. And so the fulfillment that they get is in their internal world. It's like this extreme version of introversion. And I think that that's kind of the core of all these things. And as people, and it's like a risky version. It puts the person at risk. So I want to start with how this looks with schizoid. So with schizoids, there's like you could say that their needs are so profoundly not met that they've taken this emotional core that they have and just buried it so deep within them that it's almost gone. It's like on life support, and they're just sort of automatons, just sort of acting in the world, and then they act in the world and they go home and they read their comics or their experience their sci-fi and fantasy, and in their day-to-day functioning they appear taciturn, but inside they're an emotionally starved human being. And there's this detachment they're really intellectual and rational, but there's this extreme of detachment that puts them at risk, and even can put them at risk of starving themselves, even intellectually, which seems like it should be unlikely because they're so reliant on these internal worlds and being detached, because detachment, being not part of a cultural narrative seems like it provides some inspiration for creativity. So schizoids are on the schizophrenia spectrum, but it's like they're a really, really adapted version of it. And maybe some of them even develop an extra coldness, maybe even a callousness. Callous is that I've found some schizoids that they even want to describe themselves as psychopaths, as though they're saying, that's how calloused I've become. That's how much the world of feeling is dead to me. I'm just acting in whatever way I can. The warmth is left away, but ultimately adaptive. And then take another step towards schizophrenia, and we get to schizotypal, except they don't have always flat affect. Maybe that sometimes it's inappropriate affect, and they're laughing at things at weird times and saying bizarre things because it's fun. Because why shouldn't everybody see plainly the absurdity around them? It's like the Hinsu character, except when he does get into social situations, if he sheds his social anxiety and just lets loose and just says screw it, the mad hat gets put on or taken off, and it's at risk of seeing. The schizotypal is adaptive. Anything ridiculous they say, they know it's ridiculous, and they can either talk people into it or be talked out of it. Explain the rationality of the ridiculous thing they said, or concede that the thing is irrational. They haven't left the building completely, but the inappropriate affect is there. Like they're showing the world that they're doing what they want, and they're uniting their internal world with this ridiculous culture that surrounds them. And with that, I kind of want to start my rant, and you can decide how irrational I sound. So, all right, here we go. Rant begin. So I'm going to talk to you about the collective unconscious. it's like there's this primordial ooze that the elements of our brain come from. The collective unconscious, it's like there's blueprints for a lot of our psyche that's come out of a place that is like the entirety of our evolution as this creature that has a brain. And you can feel some element of it in you. Think of, there's people who identify as pirates. For some reason, they know that they're a pirate. And because of the nature of the collective unconscious, they share every part of the ancestry and elements that the pirate was. And there's no they are, if a schizotypal says that they're a pirate, it's because they are a pirate. There's something metaphysical about our being, and I mean metaphysical in the sense that you can't quite see it or really measure it, but you know it's there. And the collective unconscious is like that. You know it's there. You know that pirate is inside of you. You know a lot of things are inside of you. There's a lot of things that you can just think and you know that they're real. I know somebody who believed on some level that he was related to the messianic figure, like a messiah, like a spiritual being. And he saw people. Like a schizotypal, you get like a sensation of people. Good, evil, toxic. I can sense toxicity. I can practically smell this person's deep, intimate kindness. And the thing about that schizotypal who believed that he was the Messiah, he's not necessarily wrong. Somebody wrote the Bible. Somebody was idealistic enough to try to transcend everything that was animalistic about everything. People created religion. It's in our collective unconscious, and the fact that he felt like a spiritual being doesn't mean that he's delusional. It means that he's part of that segment of the collective unconscious that bubbles up and fires out idealism out into the world. I can sense it too. I'm Hinsug. I can sense that section of the collective unconscious. I feel like I can sense things. I'm in this rural house in a rural area. I live in the middle of the cornfield. I live alone. And every now and then, I don't think I'm alone. I don't have to experience myself as alone. I talk to my characters. And every now and then, I think there's no reason not to think that the sounds I hear in this old house with an upstairs that's unoccupied, there's no reason for me not to think that those sounds are just a lively bunch of people, apparitions that somehow manipulated the world so that I could be here for their entertainment. Because Hinsug is inside of me. I have other characters, Trogad inside of me, this innocent, reactive character. Marrow is inside of me, something darker, even than Hinsug. And perhaps I'm here for their entertainment. Perhaps on some cosmic level, somebody like me had to exist. And even in isolation, I don't exist in isolation. We're all part of this cosmic swelling and retracting of like a unity state and a blown out state that's pulsating, and then some way along the line there's people who identify as intuitive, and they discover that reality is what you think it is. Some of it's delusional, but when you're paranoid, sometimes it's delusional. But where it comes to identity, and you have to be careful, but where it comes to identity, if you think it, you probably thought it for a reason. There's ideas of reference, but the ideas of reference, when you think things that are connected to you that aren't, they are connected to you. Maybe you upset yourself for no reason. you felt neurotic, and you're always looking for a problem, and you found the problem, and you found a threat, and you're hiding from the threat, or trying to deal with it in some way. You're paranoid and scared, right? Somebody's against you or something. Sometimes it's the case, and sometimes people aren't abusing you, but sometimes they are. And who's to say? It helps to get feedback from people who are more concrete about those things. But in general, the possibilities are there and you consider them because it is a possibility. Neuroticism is a protection, and you've escaped the world as a protection, and you've chosen an identity because the identity's there. Who's to tell schizotypal they're not a spiritual being? So now I've kind of turned this rant into. So we'll end the rant there. But what I'm doing there is I want to seem a little symptomatic. Is part of my goal. Maybe you think there's something almost extremely ADHD about all this. My attention's flitting about. If it got any worse, I'm probably at risk of some of this sounding like word salad. But I can build a narrative and a rationality around all this. I'm uniting societal narratives and my narratives, and try to incorporate why some people feel socially detached and they decide they're autistic, or just, maybe they just say, I'm just an introvert. And whatever part of it is about ADHD and schizophrenia or depression that makes it hard to focus, and your perspective flits around and you filter out certain information. I had somebody notice sometimes I pause before I react to things, as though maybe there's some bizarre filter in my perceptions. And I think it's like a version of the schizotypal adaptation that's, almost like schizophrenia, where the person's just left the building, except they've left part of the building. 1 foot in reality, 1 foot out of reality. And there's just so many ways to look at it. I think sometimes I try to bring this together with other personality disorders, and I keep thinking about narcissism, and I almost feel like it's another version of schizophrenia on some level, because schizophrenics, the way that the nature of delusion seems like it's all over the personality disorder spectrum. Like, if you talk to somebody who's narcissistic, you can pretty often tell that they're fully they're delusional. They've got some picture they're trying to paint of themselves acting in the world as they've got a funny story. Their story, it's barely veiled that it's not real. They lie all the time. They've got this ridiculous delusional ego. I think when narcissism is bad, it's like they don't take in account the needs of other people. I feel like if you can tell that you're delusional and other people are delusional, you can, and there's a way to meet in the middle, because everybody's telling themselves a story. I feel like culture is psychosis. If you think about how ridiculous our culture is, there's things in it that are so obviously delusional, baked into our culture now. And because it's something, I think what it is about being an adapted person who's living in the world that everybody else is living in, if there's something messed up and they're just completely adhere themselves to what that narrative is. It's like dogma. It's like religion. It's like a version of dogma. You don't question the cultural narrative. You just join in. If you question it, you're something else. Maybe you're the other. Well, some people are always the other because they've chosen that path, or they didn't choose it and they just, maybe they are autistic or on the bad side of the unadaptive side of schizophrenia. And I think what the solution is here is to just be aware. Be aware, to enjoy the freedom of being detached, and to know that when people's attention flits around, it's like some people say that manic depression is like a key to depression. It's like you're super out of it, but then it's almost like there's like this excited element about depression that wakes you up to some perspective that you used as like part of your own story. It's like an adaptation, and you tell that story to other people, and it's like this. It's like a guaranteed version of creativity, but to not be part of the cultural narrative, it can breed resentment. I think schizoid and schizotypal adaptations are actually good until there's this sort of toxifying, resentful, lonely feeling where that you just have to. It's hard to. Some people think there's a malignancy in schizotypal personality disorder, and I don't think it has to be. Because if you're quirky and you're paranoid and detached, and you're suffering for that detachment, eventually you're resentful of not having done what a lot of people do to be invested in the world. And you just have to let go of that resentment. You have to enjoy being yourself. You have to enjoy being Dr. Sapolsky's vision of schizotypal, which is a guy spending 8 hours in a dark projector room, and just own that character and live your life free and happy and creative. Detachment's exciting. Culture is its own version of psychosis, and if people on the schizophrenia spectrum enter this negative sense of psychosis where they're getting plagued, there's just like a storm of negative possibilities that overwhelm them. That's maybe the part that you need to have sounding boards to get people to pull you out of that. But I think the reverse is also true. Culture can be psychosis. Everybody can be sick except for the detached person. I feel like schizotypal people, and there's a lot of them, kind of have to rise up and say enough is enough. I know I'm crazy, but that is even crazier. I can see plainly that you're all in some mass hysteria. Personality cults, for example. Like, I'm going to avoid using a certain name and being too political, but I'm going to be political here for a second. Stuff that happens in a culture that even destroys relationships and people, because it's part of some identity that's like spreading. They keep choosing it despite flagrantly destructive things happening in the relationships and in the world. And people come up with all sorts of things to protect their narrative, and it's time to step out of that. It's time to stand up to dogma, even when every now and then, detached people have a dogma. I'm a pirate, or whatever it is. I'm an apparition. There's apparitions using my apparitions as a theater. I'm not alone. I think a lot of the stuff about schizophrenia is they're alone and they're staying alone, and the adaptation of schizophrenia is becoming not alone, which can be good or it can be bad. The bad end is like that extreme paranoia, right? Oh my God, is there a sniper in the distance? Is that sniper about to shoot me? Why is he after me? What does he know? Stuff like that. And I think that's where I want it to be. I think I talked about anomie. Yeah, division of labor, people not feeling like a full autonomous being. And just adapting to the world, becoming an autonomous being in your own internal world and enjoying it. Let's enjoy life, folks. Anyway, 36 minutes. Not too bad. Anyway, thank you, folks. Talk to you later. Thank you, friends. Talk to you later. Oh, quick note. Check out the Schizotypal subreddit, r/Schizotypal. It's a really good place. And also, I keep using the word schizoid or schizotypal adaptation. I want to give that credit to Eleanor Greenberg, who thinks about schizoid as an adaptation. And I think you could do that. And that's what I'm doing with schizotypal here, thinking of it as an adaptation and instead of it just strictly a disorder. Because I think it makes sense to be schizoid and it makes sense to be schizotypal, and they exist for a reason if they can function in the world, and we want them around. Thank you, friends. See you later.